When the United States first announced that the Luftwaffe, the rebuilt Air Force of West Germany, would soon receive the F-4 Phantom II, many German officers reacted with the same mixture of skepticism and disappointment. In their eyes, the Phantom was an aging brute from another era. A massive twin-engine monster designed for the early days of the Cold War, not for the high-precision, high-tech battlefield of the 1970s. German pilots had expected something sleek, modern, elegant, something closer to the legendary starfighters and interceptors they had flown before. Instead, they were told they would be flying a machine that looked more like a flying furnace than a fighter jet. They joked that the Phantom had been designed by a committee with no sense of aesthetics, that it was too heavy, too smoky, too loud, too American. They called it scrap metal before even touching the controls. But they had no idea what was coming. Because the Phantom was not pretty, it was powerful, it was not elegant, it was unbreakable. And it was not a product of fashion. It was a product of necessity, built from a world that stood on the edge of nuclear catastrophe, engineered for a kind of air war most nations were terrified to even imagine. When the Germans finally stood face to face with the aircraft at the front lines, something shifted. They saw the thick, muscular airframe, the oversized intakes feeding two roaring J-79 engines that could push the aircraft through the sound barrier with weight to spare. They saw the reinforced fuselage, the powerful radars, the weapons hardpoints built to carry more missiles than many European jets could carry fuel. They saw the scars on the American Phantoms that arrived before theirs, the patchwork repairs, the faded paint, the subtle burn marks left by combat operations in Southeast Asia. These jets had survived a war Germany had never fought. They had flown into the densest anti-aircraft fire in the world and returned home. They had fought MiGs head-on in dogfights so close the pilots could see the fear in the eyes of their opponents. These aircraft were not scrap metal, they were survivors. And when German test pilots took the Phantom into the sky for the first time, the mockery ended instantly. The F-4 did not climb. It launched, it did not accelerate, it surged forward like a missile disguised as an aircraft. The cockpit shook with raw force, the horizon fell away, and the nose punched into the sky with a kind of brutal confidence no other German fighter possessed. The Phantom felt alive in a way their previous jets never had. It did not ask the pilot for permission, it demanded commitment. It was not a jet that wanted to be coaxed, it wanted to be driven, and in that moment, German pilots understood something few outsiders ever realized. This machine had been underestimated because its power was impossible to appreciate from the ground. Soon, the Luftwaffe discovered the Phantom's second secret. It was not merely fast, it was versatile. The F-4 could intercept high-altitude bombers hours before they reached their targets. It could dogfight Soviet aircraft over the Fulda Gap. It could drop precision munitions on advancing armor. It could fire long-range missiles guided by radars powerful enough to burn through jamming. It could fly low, fast, and dirty through valleys without losing energy. And above all, it could absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other aircraft of its generation. German engineers were stunned by how difficult it was to break the Phantom, even deliberately. They pushed it beyond limits, performed aggressive maneuvers, simulated emergency failures, stressed the wings, forced the engines through violent throttle changes, and still the aircraft refused to yield. Their tests revealed something that American pilots had known for years. The F-4 Phantom II was one of the toughest aircraft ever built. It could take a beating. It could take damage. It could lose hydraulics, lose stabilizers, lose airspeed, lose half its systems, and still find a way to fly home. This resilience terrified the Warsaw Pact. Because Germany was no longer the cautious, careful air force flying delicate interceptors. It now had an aircraft that could fight tooth and nail against Soviet jets pouring through the skies of Central Europe. And Moscow knew exactly what the Phantom was capable of. They had seen what it did over Vietnam. They had seen how it flew into SAM-infested territory and survived strikes that should have killed everyone on board. They had seen it defeat MiG-17s and MiG-21s in dogfights that defied all expectations. And now that same machine was sitting on their border, painted in German colors. The Luftwaffe's perception of the Phantom changed almost overnight. What they had once called scrap metal became their pride. What they had dismissed as outdated became the backbone of their defense. and what they thought would be a burden became the most reliable aircraft the German Air Force had ever operated. But the transformation was not only technical, it was emotional. The Phantom did something to the pilots who flew it. It humbled them, it taught them respect, and then, slowly, it taught them love. Pilots spoke about the aircraft the way soldiers speak about comrades. They trusted it. They trusted its strength, its endurance, its refusal to let them down. Flying the Phantom was not just a job. It was a partnership, a pact between human and machine. A promise that no matter how dangerous the mission was, the aircraft would fight to bring them home. What truly shocked the Germans was how the Phantom behaved at the front lines during tense standoffs with Soviet aircraft. West German Phantoms patrolled the border, often encountering Soviet MiGs on the other side. The MiG pilots expected to intimidate the Germans. They were used to watching NATO pilots back off, but the Phantom changed that dynamic. When Soviet jets approached aggressively, the F-4 did not yield. It turned toward the threat, engines roaring, wings trembling with power. A Soviet MiG-23 pilot later described it in a debrief. The Phantom looked like it wanted to devour us. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a statement. Every time the F-4 took off, it reminded both sides of the Cold War what air power really meant. Not elegance, not beauty, not perfect aerodynamics, but strength, presence, dominance. And as the years went by, German pilots became experts at extracting every ounce of performance from the Phantom. They discovered that the aircraft had personality, brutal, demanding, unforgiving, but loyal. A pilot who respected the Phantom found that it would do anything for him. A pilot who underestimated it found himself fighting the aircraft as much as the enemy. By the late 1970s, the Luftwaffe had integrated the F-4 into every aspect of its air defense structure. It was their interceptor, their bomber, their air superiority fighter, their guardian over the border. And as NATO began flying large-scale exercises, the Phantom proved again and again that it was not the relic Germany once assumed it was. Instead, it was often the star of the show. American pilots joked that if the world ever ended in nuclear fire, the only things left alive would be cockroaches and F-4 Phantoms. Germany, once skeptical, now agreed. The Phantom was the one aircraft they trusted when everything else failed. And deep inside the NATO command structure, an understanding began to spread. If war ever erupted in Europe, the first thing Soviet pilots would see was not elegant Western engineering. It was the dark, muscular outline of an F-4 Phantom II accelerating toward them with smoke trailing behind it and missiles locked. And in that moment, finally, the world would understand what the Germans had come to accept. The Phantom wasn't scrap metal. It was the frontline defender of freedom in the most dangerous place on Earth. As the years passed, something remarkable began happening inside the Luftwaffe. The pilots who once mocked the Phantom as a clumsy American relic started defending it with an almost fanatical pride. They told new recruits stories about its raw power, its resilience, and the strange sense of invincibility that settled over the cockpit when its engines lit up. And the more missions they flew, the clearer it became that the aircraft had been misunderstood not only by Germany, but by nearly every air force that had never fought a real modern war. It was born in the early 1960s, forged in an era when the world believed nuclear war could erupt at any moment. Everything about it reflected that urgency. Its oversized intakes were not aesthetic flaws, they were survival mechanisms. Its engines were not fuel efficient, they were brute force power sources meant to outrun anything the Soviets could field. Its twin-seat cockpit was not a limitation. It was a strategic advantage, allowing a pilot and a weapons officer to share the burden of controlling a machine capable of intercepting bombers at extreme altitudes while engaging fighters at supersonic speeds. Germany realized this only after putting the aircraft through real combat simulations. They discovered that the F-4 could dogfight more aggressively than expected. It could sustain high G turns longer than many of its lighter European competitors. It could deliver precise missile shots at distances that shocked even experienced pilots. But what astonished the Luftwaffe most was how quickly the Phantom adapted to the German way of flying. German pilots had been trained to fly sleek, fast interceptors, aircraft that demanded perfect precision and punished the slightest mistake. But the Phantom welcomed imperfection. It did not fall apart when pushed beyond recommended limits. It did not snap under structural stress. It did not choke when weather turned against it or engines were throttled violently. Instead, the Phantom seemed to awaken under pressure, as if it were designed not for ideal conditions, but for the worst ones imaginable. They stopped comparing it to their older jets and started comparing it to their adversaries. They ran test engagements against simulated MiG tactics. They practiced high-speed intercepts over the North Sea. They challenged the Phantom in mountainous regions, where winds carved violent currents along the terrain. And each time the F-4 responded with the same message: "Push me harder." The Phantom was unlike any aircraft Germany had flown before because it carried something deeper than performance. It carried legacy. Every bolt, every weld, every panel had been shaped by the lessons Americans had learned in Vietnam, lessons written in blood. And Germany knew that kind of experience could not be replicated in a laboratory or a design studio. It could only be earned. What truly cemented the Phantom's reputation in the Luftwaffe came during NATO's large-scale exercises. For the first time, German pilots flew alongside American, British, Dutch, and Canadian aircraft in missions designed to simulate an all-out conflict with the Warsaw Pact. The Germans expected to be overshadowed by more advanced jets. The Phantom climbed faster than many expected. It accelerated out of tight turns with astonishing power. It could fire radar-guided missiles at ranges that embarrassed older NATO fighters. And in close combat, its massive engines allowed it to force overshoots by simply outpowering opponents. American pilots who had flown the aircraft in Vietnam frequently told their German counterparts the same thing. The Phantom doesn't glide, it fights. And the Luftwaffe discovered exactly what that meant during mock dogfights against NATO's own fighters. The F-4 could impose its will on the engagement. It could convert its weight into momentum, its drag into stability, its speed into dominance. It was like wrestling a bull that had learned to think like a wolf. Soon, Germany began modifying the Phantom to meet their own needs. They upgraded radars, improved avionics, refined weapon systems, strengthened structures, and even developed new tactics tailored to the aircraft's strengths. And with each improvement, the Phantom evolved from a temporary solution into an indispensable asset. It became the spine of Germany's air defense network. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviets were watching. They had never forgotten their encounters with the Phantom in the skies over Vietnam, where MiGs were often outmaneuvered or overwhelmed by the American brute. But now, the Soviet Union faced a new reality. The Phantom, once an American threat, had become a German threat. And this version of the F-4 was more refined, more disciplined, more integrated into NATO's command structure. Soviet pilots began encountering F-4s during border patrols and training intercepts. MiG pilots expected German aircraft to maintain safe distance, avoiding escalation. But Phantom pilots were no longer flying timid interceptors. They were flying machines confident in their strength. And that confidence changed the atmosphere of every encounter. Soviet pilots reported that German F-4s flew aggressively, closing distances fast, placing themselves in tactical positions that forced MiGs to react. They described the Phantom as unnervingly assertive, a jet that seemed eager for confrontation even when peace was fragile. The Soviet Union realized that the Luftwaffe had become a far more capable force. But the true test of Germany's relationship with the Phantom came during dangerous real-world incidents, moments when war nearly ignited across the border. One such event occurred in the late 1970s when a Soviet reconnaissance aircraft crossed into NATO airspace. German Phantoms were scrambled immediately. The jets roared into the sky, closing the distance at supersonic speed. Instead, the F-4s moved directly into an intercept position, boxing the aircraft in, sending a clear message: "Turn back now." The Soviet aircraft complied. That moment changed something profound in the NATO command structure. Germany had shown that it was no longer the hesitant air power it had once been. It was assertive, confident, ready. Visiting US pilots would later joke that German Phantom crews had become more phantom than the Phantom S creators, because the Germans had taken an aircraft they once dismissed and turned it into a symbol of their rebirth, a symbol of strength balanced by discipline. But the Phantom's impact went even deeper within Germany. It became a cultural icon. Children grew up watching Phantoms streak across the sky during air shows, roaring past with trails of smoke marking their path. Youths who dreamed of becoming pilots did not imagine themselves flying lightweight modern jets. They imagined themselves flying the Phantom. They wanted the power, the sound, the presence, the legend. Germany's F-4s participated in NATO's most dangerous exercises, often performing the missions considered too demanding for other aircraft. They flew in harsh weather conditions, in high turbulence, in near-stall scenarios, in low-altitude runs through valleys that tested the bravery of even the most experienced pilots. The Phantom handled it all without complaint, and with each mission, Germany's trust in the aircraft deepened. But the turning point in Germany's Phantom legacy came with the realization that the aircraft was not merely a weapon, it was a deterrent. Its presence alone was enough to influence Soviet behavior. MiG pilots began approaching German airspace with greater caution. Soviet reconnaissance flights adjusted their routes. Warsaw Pact planners reconsidered their offensive strategies. And all of this happened because of the silhouette of a jet that had once been called worthless. The Phantom gave Germany something they had not had since the end of World War II: the ability to project strength without provoking fear. It showed the world that Germany could be powerful, responsible, and reliable. And because of that, the Phantom became more than a frontline fighter. It became a symbol of stability in a region where stability was fragile. It marked Germany's transition from a nation restrained by its past to a nation prepared to defend its future. The Phantom was not just a tool of war. It was a bridge between eras. NATO commanders praised Germany's Phantom squadrons as some of the best trained in Europe. American officers frequently commented on the precision and professionalism of German crews. Even former skeptics admitted that the Phantom program had become one of the most successful military integrations in NATO history. What none of them fully realized at the time was that the Phantom had reshaped Germany's identity. And it had done all of this not by being beautiful or cutting edge, but by being relentless, dependable, and unbreakable. By the early 1980s, the Luftwaffe had transformed into one of the most respected and capable air forces in Europe, and at the center of that transformation stood the F-4 Phantom II, a machine that Germany had once dismissed as outdated and inelegant, but now relied upon more than any aircraft in its inventory. What had begun as skepticism had evolved into admiration, and eventually into dependence, because the Phantom had proven again and again that it was not a jet built for display or superficial appeal, but a jet engineered for survival, dominance, and reliability in the most unpredictable environments imaginable. German pilots flew it through bitter winters, violent storms, sudden fog, and harsh crosswinds rolling over the mountains and the North Sea. And each time the aircraft behaved like an indestructible extension of their own will. Soviet pilots soon noticed that the Germans' flying Phantoms were different from those who had previously flown lighter, more fragile interceptors. They were more confident, more aggressive, more willing to push confrontations to the limit. This change alarmed Warsaw Pact commanders, who had counted on Germany remaining cautious, restrained by its post-war identity. But the Phantom had given German pilots something deeper than performance. It had given them a sense of authority in the sky. During NATO's massive exercises across Central Europe, the Phantom repeatedly demonstrated that it could outperform expectations in every category that mattered. It intercepted bombers faster than predicted, held missile locks at longer ranges, and dominated close-in engagements using raw power to force enemy fighters into overshoots. German weapons officers became masters at operating the Phantom's radar systems, detecting Soviet aircraft attempting to mask themselves behind terrain or cloud formations, and when the Phantom appeared over the border, the Soviets treated it differently from other NATO aircraft. They gave it more space, more respect, and more caution, because they knew the Phantom's combat history and had studied the records from Vietnam, where it survived damage that would have destroyed other jets and returned home to fight another day. Inside Germany, the aircraft became a symbol of a new era. Civilians gathered near bases to watch it take off, children memorized the shape of its silhouette, and families living near training corridors would recognize the jet long before they saw it, because the Phantom did not whisper through the sky. It carved through it like a blade heated by fire. The Luftwaffe used the Phantom for interception, air defense, ground attack, reconnaissance, and patrol missions. It had become so versatile that Germany no longer viewed it as a temporary platform, filling a gap until something better arrived. It was their backbone, their workhorse, their frontline guardian, and it grew into something even more meaningful. A source of national confidence in a period when Germany was still redefining itself on the world stage. The Soviet Union monitored this transformation with increasing concern. They observed how German Phantoms began meeting MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and even early MiG-29 prototypes with unflinching assertiveness. In declassified reports, Soviet pilots described German Phantom crews as fearless and direct. Pilots who no longer hesitated to approach the border aggressively, forcing the Soviets to adjust their flight patterns to avoid escalation. This was not the Germany the Soviet Union had expected to face. This was a Germany flying an aircraft that did not retreat, did not flinch, and did not break under stress. The Phantom also strengthened Germany's strategic influence within NATO. American commanders were impressed by how efficiently the Luftwaffe integrated the aircraft into their doctrine. British crews who flew alongside German Phantoms remarked on their discipline and precision. The Belgian and Dutch air forces frequently coordinated joint exercises with Germany, and each time the Phantom served as the anchor of complex multi-nation combat simulations. Its ability to perform in every role allowed Germany to lead missions rather than simply participate in them. And when NATO began planning the defenses of the Fulda Gap, the most likely invasion route for the Warsaw Pact, the Phantom became central to those plans. It would be the first jet to respond, the first to intercept, the first to engage, and the first to absorb the opening shock of war. The Luftwaffe trained for these scenarios relentlessly. Phantom squadrons practiced low-altitude penetration runs through valleys, where cliffs flashed past their wingtips in blurred streaks of grey and green. They flew high-altitude intercepts against simulated Soviet bombers while coordinating with ground radar systems, adjusting positions with split-second timing. They conducted night operations under minimal visibility, trusting their instruments, instincts, and the Phantom's rugged stability. And through every scenario, the aircraft refused to show weakness. It remained steady in turbulence, obedient in high-speed dives, powerful in vertical climbs, and unwavering under rapid maneuvering that would have pushed lesser jets into aerodynamic chaos. It was this combination of durability, adaptability, and raw force that turned the Phantom into the pride of the German Air Force. The jet's heavy smoke trail, once mocked by pilots expecting sleek European designs, became a badge of honor. That trail meant power. That trail meant presence. That trail meant Germany had a machine that could not be ignored. Soviet pilots learned to recognize the smoke before seeing the jet itself, and many described the moment as unnerving. They knew what followed. That trail was not a relic, but a predator. Germany refined the Phantom even further through upgrades that enhanced its radar range, improved its missile compatibility, strengthened its engines, and allowed it to perform more advanced strike missions. Engineers marveled at how forgiving the aircraft was toward modifications. It accepted improvements willingly, as though it had been designed from birth to evolve. As technology advanced, the Phantom advanced with it. It became faster to respond, quicker to lock targets, more stable in harsh weather, and more lethal when carrying modern munitions. Each upgrade cemented the aircraft's role in Germany's deterrence strategy. The aircraft also forged a bond between pilots that was unlike anything seen before. The Phantom demanded respect, strength, precision, and courage, and it shaped pilots who could meet those demands. When a Phantom pilot strapped into the cockpit, he was joining a lineage of aviators who had flown the jet through real war. German pilots felt the weight of that legacy. They trained harder because of it. They focused deeper because of it. They respected the machine because of it. Veterans of the Luftwaffe often described the Phantom not as an aircraft, but as a trusted companion, one that carried them through storms, through borderline situations, through split-second decisions that could have ended in disaster. The aircraft had a soul forged in fire, and those who flew it learned to trust that soul implicitly. By the time Germany was preparing to transition to more modern fighters, many pilots openly admitted they did not want to give up the Phantom. It had defined their careers, and more importantly, it had defined their confidence in combat. The aircraft had taken Germany from hesitant rearmament to genuine strength on the world stage, and as tensions rose and fell during the Cold War, the Phantom stood as a symbol of Germany's determination to protect its people and fulfill its NATO commitments. But its greatest legacy came from how it changed the mindset of adversaries. Soviet records revealed that when intelligence officers assessed NATO's fighters, the German Phantom squadrons were consistently rated as one of the most dangerous threats. Not because the aircraft was the most advanced, but because the pilots flying it used it to its fullest potential. They flew with confidence that bordered on audacity, and that confidence changed the psychological balance over Europe. This was the true power of the Phantom. It was not the fastest jet, not the most modern, not the most beautiful, but it had something deeper: endurance, authority, trust, transformation. And Germany embraced those qualities until the end of the Cold War. The Phantom became more than a fighter. It became a guardian, a warning, a statement, and a promise. A promise that Germany would never again underestimate a machine simply because it did not look the way they expected it to look. The Phantom had come to Germany as scrap metal in their minds. It left as legend in their hearts. As the Cold War deepened and Europe watched its borders with growing tension, the F-4 Phantom II continued shaping the identity, tactics, and culture of the Luftwaffe in ways almost no one had predicted. The aircraft that once arrived under clouds of suspicion had now become the standard by which German aviators measured every other fighter. Its presence radiated confidence across NATO and unease across the Warsaw Pact, because the Soviets no longer saw the German Air Force as a conservative, cautious element hidden behind American power. They saw it as a fierce, disciplined, and highly capable force with pilots who flew the Phantom not only with technical skill, but with conviction. The aircraft's imposing silhouette had become part of the daily rhythm of life near the border. Residents living in West German towns would feel windows tremble when the Phantom thundered above them, climbing steeply or descending low across farmland and forest to rehearse attack patterns, reconnaissance routes, or defensive intercept profiles. The jet was loud, unapologetically loud, but its sound brought reassurance. It was the sound of protection, of readiness, of a nation standing guard. Inside the Luftwaffe, the Phantom shaped not only operations but the very mindset of the pilots. The aircraft demanded a level of focus few jets required. At high speeds, the Phantom did not tolerate indecision. It rewarded assertiveness and punished hesitation. Pilots learned to make split-second choices, to anticipate enemy movement, to trust their instincts fused with the aircraft's raw behavior. Many aviators described the Phantom as something that taught them who they were, as if flying it revealed a deeper version of themselves. It was a machine that pulled the truth out of a pilot. It revealed strength, discipline, courage, and sometimes fear that had to be transformed into resolve. And through this transformation, the Phantom forged not just better pilots, but better leaders. This evolution was most visible during NATO's increasingly complex war simulations. Germany often volunteered its Phantom squadrons for the hardest missions, the ones requiring precise timing, aggressive maneuvering, and creative adaptation. The aircraft's unique blend of durability and speed allowed it to perform roles that other fighters struggled with. It could launch at dawn in terrible weather, push through turbulent layers of cloud, strike simulated targets, engage mock enemy fighters, refuel in mid-air, and return to base hours later without a hint of mechanical complaint. The Phantom thrived on workload. It thrived on intensity, and the Germans soon realized that the more they demanded from it, the more the Phantom revealed its true character. One of the defining moments of the Phantom's service in Germany came during a massive NATO readiness exercise when electronic warfare conditions simulated complete radar degradation. Most aircraft struggled in the chaos. The Phantom did not. German pilots flew it by instinct, navigating through thick, simulated jamming, using low-altitude terrain masking and clever maneuvering to attack designated targets and intercept enemy intruders. Few outside observers understood how remarkable this was. The Phantom's origins lay in the analog era, yet here it was, outperforming aircraft built decades later. This ability to bridge eras, to combine old-world toughness with modern tactical imagination, was what kept the Phantom relevant long after other jets of its generation had faded into history. And on the opposite side of Europe, Soviet analysts watched all of this with increasing concern. They had long assumed that the Luftwaffe would rely heavily on American direction if war ever erupted. But they began to notice something unsettling. Germany was no longer following, it was leading. Its Phantom squadrons were setting the tone for NATO readiness, shaping doctrine, influencing joint missions, and demonstrating levels of coordination that worried Soviet planners. For a Warsaw Pact that relied heavily on overwhelming numbers and swift combined arms assault, the idea of facing a Germany backed by dozens of Phantom squadrons, pilots who flew as if possessed by the spirit of the aircraft, was far from comforting. Another factor that made the Phantom integral to Germany's defense posture was the psychological impact it had on pilots during the most dangerous scenarios. Germany rehearsed responses to border violations, airspace intrusions, and intercept missions where timing was critical. The Phantom excelled in these high-stress engagements. Its raw engine thrust allowed it to climb rapidly and close distance faster than expected. Its radar systems, although older in design, were robust and resistant to early Soviet jamming methods. Pilots often spoke about the moment they first saw a Soviet aircraft on their radar scopes while flying the Phantom. They described a sense of calm, as if the aircraft itself steadied them. The Phantom had been built for conflict. It radiated a confidence that transferred into the hands of the aviator. One of the most iconic incidents occurred when a Soviet reconnaissance aircraft made a deep approach toward NATO airspace. German Phantoms were scrambled. They intercepted the intruder with assertiveness that forced the Soviet crew to withdraw. But what stood out in reports was not the outcome, but the demeanor of the German pilots. They executed the intercept flawlessly, held formation with disciplined proximity, and demonstrated absolute control of the engagement. The Soviets reported that the Germans behaved like veterans of conflict, not like aviators from a nation that had avoided major war for decades. This single incident triggered a re-evaluation among Soviet commanders about Germany's true readiness. The Phantom also became a cultural anchor within the Luftwaffe. Pilots decorated their lockers with Phantom insignias, painted Phantom silhouettes on squadron banners, and established traditions centered around the aircraft. New pilots were not just trained, they were initiated into a legacy. Veterans passed down stories of daring maneuvers, dangerous missions, and narrow escapes, teaching younger aviators to respect the aircraft's capabilities and temperament. The Phantom demanded discipline, but it rewarded loyalty with performance that bordered on miraculous. There were cases where the aircraft returned safely, even after severe damage or system failure. Mechanics would examine the fuselage and shake their heads in disbelief. The Phantom was stubborn in the best possible way. And while the Luftwaffe embraced the Phantom wholeheartedly, the Soviet Union viewed this development as a shift in the balance of psychological warfare. A confident Germany, armed with a machine that survived the worst skies of Vietnam and thrived in the unpredictable weather of Central Europe, posed a challenge both tactically and symbolically. The Soviets tried to counter with new aircraft, expanding their MiG and Sukhoi fleets, but the Phantom had already achieved something more valuable than sheer performance. It had earned reputation. Reputation in war is not measured in blueprints or specifications. It is measured in fear, respect, and expectation. And the Phantom influenced all three. The aircraft's impact went even further as Germany worked increasingly closely with the United States. Joint exercises revealed how smoothly German Phantoms operated alongside American ones, as if the jets themselves recognized each other. American crews often praised German Phantom squadrons for their professionalism and tactical creativity. This strengthened military partnerships and deepened NATO's sense of unity in the air. Where once Germany had been expected to follow American lead, now it acted as an equal ally, carrying significant responsibility in joint missions. This sense of responsibility shaped German national identity during the final decade of the Cold War. The Phantom had not merely strengthened Germany militarily, it had strengthened Germany psychologically. It allowed the nation to redefine itself not by the shadows of its past, but by the discipline, professionalism, and integrity of its pilots. Across West Germany, the Phantom became a symbol of trust. Citizens believed in the aircraft and in the men who flew it. It was not a machine of conquest, but a machine of protection. And yet, despite all of this, perhaps the most remarkable part of the Phantom's service in Germany was how deeply it embedded itself into the memories of the pilots who flew it. Long after retiring, many aviators would describe their years with the Phantom as the most defining period of their lives. They remembered the cockpit vibration during afterburner ignition, the subtle rumble as the jet pushed through dense clouds, the feeling of the nose lifting under full power, the precise feedback of the controls during tight maneuvers, and the unshakable sense that the aircraft would do everything in its power to keep them alive. They remembered the fear before critical missions and the relief afterward. And in between those emotions stood the Phantom, steady, loyal, and relentless. This was the legacy Germany inherited from an aircraft it initially did not want. An aircraft that came from another continent, another doctrine, another mindset. But once the Phantom touched German soil and German skies, it became theirs. It shaped their pilots, intimidated their adversaries, earned the respect of their allies, and protected their nation. The Phantom did not just serve in Germany, it transformed Germany. And as the Cold War moved toward its final years, the aircraft stood ready, waiting, still roaring across the sky with the same ferocity it had shown from the beginning, reminding the world that legends are not born from perfection, but from resilience, from survival, and from the unbreakable bond between a machine and the people who trust their lives to it. By the final decade of the Cold War, the F-4 Phantom II had become more than just a fighter jet to Germany. It had become an institution, a guardian, and in many ways a quiet symbol of the strength and discipline that defined the new German identity. The aircraft that had once arrived as an unwelcome outsider evolved into the heart of the Luftwaffe's confidence, shaping not only tactics, and as the world moved closer to the end of an era defined by suspicion and confrontation, the Phantom stood as a reminder that even machines can become legends when placed in the right hands. Pilots spoke often about the feeling of sitting inside the cockpit during those border patrols, a feeling of intense concentration mixed with quiet reassurance. The cockpit smelled of metal hydraulic fluid and the faint scent of heated insulation. The instruments glowed in muted tones, the canopy reflected the stars, and in the center of all of it, the Phantom vibrated with a low, steady hum, as if whispering that no matter what awaited beyond the border, it was ready. But it was the most dependable. And dependability is what wins the opening seconds of a war. The truth became clear during one of the most tense NATO alert events of the period, when radar operators detected what appeared to be a high-speed Soviet aircraft approaching restricted airspace. Without hesitation, Phantom crews scrambled. The jets bolted down the runway with the violent thrust of afterburners shaking the ground beneath them, climbing sharply through thick clouds as the early morning sky brightened from black to dark blue. The Phantom was designed for moments like this. When the German Phantoms intercepted the unidentified aircraft, their precision and control left a deep impression on NATO commanders reviewing the operation. There was no panic, no hesitation, only decisive action. And the Soviets watching from the other side understood something profound. Germany was ready for war, not because it wanted one, but because it had mastered the aircraft born from a war it never fought. The Phantom's influence spread beyond the military sphere. In cultural memory, it became a piece of the nation's landscape. People who lived near bases remembered the tremor through the air when Phantoms tore overhead in formation. Photographers captured striking images of the aircraft slicing above rolling hills or racing along runways with wings angled sharply upward. Children built models of it, drew pictures of it, and dreamed of one day flying it themselves. It represented something stable and strong during years when Europe felt like two continents welded uneasily together. The Phantom also played a pivotal role as Germany transitioned toward reunification. In those uncertain months, when the world watched an old border dissolve and a new country take shape, Phantom squadrons maintained their patrols with the same discipline as always. The aircraft flew above shifting political landscapes without wavering, and in doing so, it provided a sense of continuity, a reminder that even as maps changed and walls fell, certain responsibilities remained unchanged, even after reunification, as Germany prepared to adopt more modern aircraft. The Phantom refused to fade quietly. It continued flying with the same ferocity and determination, often outperforming jets that were younger, sleeker, and packed with more advanced electronics. There is something timeless about a machine that responds to pressure with strength rather than fragility. Pilots who converted to newer aircraft often admitted privately that nothing felt quite like the Phantom. It had a weight to its presence, not physical weight, but emotional weight. A seriousness, a soul forged from the combination of American engineering, German discipline, and decades of shared history in the skies above a divided world. And then came the day Germany prepared to say goodbye. It was a farewell marked not by sadness alone, but by reverence. Crowds gathered near air bases. Veterans returned to watch their old squadrons fly. Mechanics who had spent entire careers repairing every bolt and panel stood silently as the jets rolled out for their final demonstrations. And when the Phantoms took off, people felt the air vibrate the way it always had. The jets climbed with the same raw energy, the same trail of smoke curling behind them. The same unmistakable sound that had echoed across Germany for generations. It was as if the aircraft wanted to remind everyone that it was leaving not because it had grown weak, but because it had fulfilled its purpose. The Luftwaffe held ceremonial flights, painting special colors on the final aircraft, honoring the machine that had stood as its backbone through some of the most tense decades in modern history. Pilots who had flown it for thousands of hours described the farewell as watching a friend depart for the last time. They touched the fuselage one more time, feeling the cool metal, remembering the countless takeoffs, landings, missions, and near misses. And some admitted that no matter what aircraft they flew afterward, part of their spirit would always remain in the Phantom's cockpit. The Soviets who once feared it, and the Allies who once underestimated it, both recognized the truth. Germany had taken the Phantom far beyond its original design, transforming it into a weapon of precision, deterrence, and psychological dominance. And in hangars, in museums, in photographs, in the memories of those who lived through its era, the Phantom remains alive. A reminder that sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones shaped to look perfect, but the ones built to endure the storm and teach an entire nation how to stand strong inside it.